This is Gray Matter, where we process the gray areas of culture. I'm Kaitlin Puccio, and today I will be talking about othering the trans community. So there are some questions that are difficult to answer because they deal with abstract moral issues rather than fact-based issues. While questions that need to be answered with science can also be difficult to answer, there's at least an objective answer. Ethical questions, which may not have a definitive answer, often have scientific components that can help harness and guide what would otherwise be a fully abstract analysis. And scientific questions, which do have a definitive answer, at least as definitive as can be in accordance with our limited man-made logic and equally limited powers of objective and complete observation, they often have ethical components that complicate what would otherwise seem to be an obvious conclusion. In either scenario, it's insufficient to rely solely on either scientific analysis or moral abstraction to support a conclusion. Science without ethics is inhuman, and morals without science are noumenal or metaphysical. So when discussing real-world moral issues with real-world moral consequences, we need to rely on the science that's available to us to support our ethical conclusions, given that we intend for our ethical conclusions to be effectuated in the practical world rather than in the abstract world. If we ignore the science, hurling weightless moral conclusions at intellectual opponents will leave no impact. For example, the discussion about whether transgender women, biological men, should be allowed in women's sports has stalled because the argument starts and ends with ethics. If we're fortunate enough to be faced with an ethical question that has a clear scientific element, we cannot ignore the science, even if it's inconvenient to our ethical argument. Science is limited. It's limited because humans are limited. The science that we know and rely upon is the science that's available to us and that we can comprehend. It does not necessarily mean that we understand it correctly or that what we know is all there is to know. But to function, we need to rely on the science that we know until we know more or differently. In this instance, we know that the male and female genome differ in that men have one X and one Y chromosome, and females have two X chromosomes. So a human egg contains only an X chromosome. A human sperm contains either an X or Y chromosome, thereby determining the biological sex of the offspring after fertilization. So the offspring will have one pair of sex chromosomes in each cell, again with the Y chromosome being present in males. This biological distinction has traditionally been sufficient to define the terms male and female, or their counterparts, man and woman. Chromosomal abnormality or chromosomal aberration can occur, including in intersex individuals who may have a mix of chromosomes such as XXY, or some cells that are XY and some that are XX or something similar. The specific type of aberration has traditionally determined the sex of the individual, based in some cases on other biological indicators. Given that the contemporary colloquial definition of woman is currently under review by the general public, it's best to move forward with the argument without using the term at all. So, whether or not it is appropriate to use the term woman to refer to transgender women is not the issue here, and it's getting in the way of the true question of whether these individuals should be allowed to compete in women's sports, where women's sports has traditionally been understood as using the chromosomal definition of female. So to move forward, we need to ensure that terminology is not a hindrance and remove all potential issues regarding defining the term woman in a way that's understood by all parties. Consequently, the term woman itself can't be used, nor can any of its substitute terms, such as birthing person or person with a uterus, as these substitute terms give rise to definitional issues themselves. So the argument should start at a chromosomal level, even if it means temporarily dehumanizing individuals. So the analysis would then be, we have XX sports teams and XY sports teams. Should XY individuals be permitted to play on XX sports teams? There's no question of gender identity here because at a chromosomal level, no gender identity exists. So in essence, it's the ultimate equalizer. XX and XY sports teams came into existence as separate and distinct teams, largely because of the differences in the physical capabilities of XX and XY individuals. Using traditional terms, men have a biological advantage over women, meaning they tend to be bigger, faster, stronger, etc. The immediate reaction is to either attack the definition of men or say that the idea that they have a biological advantage over women is false. So to respond, we again have to reduce the terms. So this would be XY individuals are bigger, faster, stronger, etc. than XX individuals. The Y chromosome in XY individuals contains the SRY gene. This increases testosterone and aggression, which contributes to the development of muscle mass and strength, stronger and more robust bones and joint surfaces, more bone development at muscle attachment sites. It's in this sense that XY individuals have a biological advantage over XX individuals. Even if XY individuals take hormones that block testosterone, the developmental advantage, for example, the physical formation of muscle attachment sites, remains, and thus the hormone levels at the time of competition are not the only consideration. So if we accept from this that XY individuals have this kind of biological advantage over XX individuals in a sports context, then XY individuals should not be permitted to compete on XX individuals' teams. But the discussion doesn't end there. If we bring the human factor back in, it becomes a social issue once again, instead of a detached scientific analysis. So if an XY individual who should not be permitted to compete on XX individuals' teams, according to the scientific argument, identifies as a woman, using the malleable contemporary definition of woman that includes how one feels rather than using the scientific definition, that individual should be able to join in the societal function of a sport comprised of other individuals of the same kind. This is a human argument rather than a scientific one. The argument moves us from the purely scientific realm to the ethical realm. Now, if our science tells us that this female identifying individual has a biological advantage over other females, and the conclusion arrived at by applying that science to real-world issues is that such an advantage is impermissible, the question becomes, what do we do about it? If we allow the individual to compete, we're knowingly disadvantaging competitors. Granting a transgender woman the right to be competitive in a certain scenario should not come at the expense of other women's rights to be competitive. If this is the case, do we allow the transgender women to instead compete on a separate team for transgender competitors? The argument against this is that we're then othering transgender women by giving them their own team. We're saying then that they do not belong on the women's team because they're not women. The issue with this is that it's a question of terminology. We're already othering by referring to transgender women as transgender women instead of women. But we need to do so in order to be able to have the necessary conversations surrounding trans rights. And if transgender individuals state themselves that they're part of the trans community and they refer to themselves as trans men and trans women, then there should be no issue with referring to them as trans women instead of women when having these conversations. And in doing so, recognizing that there is indeed a distinction between trans women and women in the traditional sense of the term. So, admitting that XY individuals have a biological advantage over XX individuals is not conceding the entire ethical argument about a female identifying XY individuals' rights in sports. It's getting us to a point where we can actually start to have the ethical discussion about trans rights and women's rights. If we're able to agree that XY individuals have a biological advantage over XX individuals, we will be able to discuss how to proceed so that no individual's rights are trampled in an effort to make way for or preserve another individual's rights. If we remain stuck arguing about settled science, no one's rights will be protected. And if we're not able to agree that XY individuals have a biological advantage over XX individuals, it's imperative to understand and explain where the science is wrong or why the interpretation of the science is incorrect. If an individual does not accept the facts as the first step toward the ethical analysis, then the science is what's really at issue, and not the moral question of whether or not transgender women should be permitted to compete in women's sports.